Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. I am joined by a friend of mine, Ben Norton. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report, and today we'll be talking about Syria and getting his take on what happened and what will be unfolding in the coming months. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
So, obviously, a lot has unfolded in the Middle East. Perhaps a good place to start is just to give us a brief overview of the conflict. How it evolved and who were the players involved here.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, the Syrian government was overthrown on the 8th of December. This is a major change in the region. Syria had been at the heart of what's known as the Axis of Resistance. These are the groups that have been supporting Palestinians fighting against Israeli colonialism and also the US. Of course, the United States has invaded many countries in the region, has meddled in their internal affairs. So if you really want to understand what's going on, of course, you could go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement during World War I, in which the European colonial powers carved up the region. But more recently, we don't need to go back 100 years. We can kind of go back to the Iraq War. And what we're really seeing is a lot of repercussions of the U.S. invasion and the instability and chaos that it unleashed in the region. Of course, Syria is a neighbor of Iraq. And after the Iraq War, there were also the protests of 2011, many of which were backed by the US, not all of them. These were known in the Western media as the so-called Arab Spring, which, is a very Orientalist Western term. But the point is that in many countries in the region, there were protests. However, what's interesting is that the West, the US-led West, only supported some of those protests. So, for instance, there were also protests in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain. And the US not only did it not support them, it actually opposed those protests. Saudi Arabia invaded Bahrain with the support of the US to crush the protests. The US has military bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. So the Gulf monarchies were allowed to stay in power. But then the US backed protests in other countries, especially in Libya and in Syria. And the protests in Libya were used as an excuse to militarily intervene. In 2011, NATO destroyed the Libyan state, brutally bombed Libya, which had previously been the most prosperous country on the African continent with the highest living standards according to the Human Development Index. Today, a decade later, 13 years later, Libya is a failed state. There's still no central unified government, like in Somalia. It has been in a state of civil war for over a decade. They completely destroyed the country. That was Libya. And then in Syria, there were also protests. Again, there were protests in many countries across the region. And the US backed those protests, funding groups, arming groups. It quickly became militarized. And then the CIA launched this program known as Operation Timber Sycamore, in which the CIA spent $1 billion per year, according to the Washington Post, which was one out of every $15 in the CIA's budget, arming and training the rebels, so-called moderate rebels in Syria, who were trying to overthrow the Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad. And of course, the Western narrative is these are plucky rebels fighting against an evil dictatorship. But in the reality, every single country in the region is so-called authoritarian, which is a term we, of course, really doesn't mean anything. I mean, the U.S. is also authoritarian. Look how they treat protesters. The U.S. has around 5% of the world's population, but 1/4 of the world's prisoners. There are more people in prison in the US than there were at the height of the gulags in the Soviet Union, but they claim to be the beacon of democracy. But the point is that Syria was portrayed as somehow unique, when in reality, the US has no problem propping up dictatorships in Saudi Arabia, which is a hereditary monarchy, in the UAE, a hereditary monarchy, in Qatar, a monarchy, Bahrain, a monarchy, Kuwait, a monarchy, but there's no concern over those monarchies. Instead, Syria was portrayed as some kind of unique evil dictatorship. Why is that? A variety of reasons. One, Syria was again at the heart of the axis of resistance, supporting the Palestinian struggle. Syria had provided weapons and support to the Palestinian armed groups and to Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance fighting against Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. And Iran had been a close ally of Syria. And Iran had also used Syrian land to ship weapons and other equipment to these forces in the region. Syria had refused to recognize the Israeli regime out of solidarity with the Palestinians. Since 1967, Israel has militarily occupied Syrian territory according to international law. The Golan Heights is Syrian territory that has been illegally occupied by Israel. And also, there are other geopolitical considerations. Turkey, which is a member of NATO, has been trying to overthrow the Syrian government for a variety of reasons. It wants a more closely allied government. Syria historically was part of the Ottoman Empire, and Erdogan is trying to bring back elements of the Ottoman Empire. He also wanted to build a pipeline going through from Qatar, through Saudi Arabia, through Syria, and then through Turkey into Europe, through Bulgaria and into Western Europe eventually. And this was a way of not only Turkey wanted it and Qatar wanted it because they would make money from it. Qatar is one of the world's leading gas exporters. But furthermore, it was a way for Europe to reduce its dependency on Russian gas and instead get more gas from the Persian Gulf. That's not the only reason. There are people who say this is a pipeline war. There were a lot of different reasons. In all of these wars, there are always multiple reasons. But essentially, the Syrian government for decades was seen by the United States as one of these countries in the region that didn't follow orders. It was not an obedient client regime. This goes back to Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, who was previously the longtime leader of Syria, from the Ba'ath Party, which is an Arab nationalist party. And the Iraqi government was also governed by a different branch of the Ba'ath Party. It's complicated because the Iraqi and Syrian branches of the Ba'ath Party split off. But the point is that this comes out of the Arab nationalist movement, going back to, for instance, in Egypt, you had Nasser, the great Arab nationalist, anti-imperialist leader. So the US has tried to crush Arab nationalism like it tried to crush communism during the Cold War. And instead, the US has supported Islamist groups, including extremist groups. So what the US did in Syria is very similar to what the US did in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the CIA spent billions of dollars arming and training the original so-called moderate rebels, who were the Mujahideen, who were Islamist extremists, who were fighting against the Afghan socialist government, which was backed by the Soviet Union. So there are a lot of parallels between what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s and what is going on in Syria. In fact, in Afghanistan in the 1980s, it gave birth to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda. And one of the people involved in supporting the Mujahideen and raising funds for them was Osama bin Laden, who at the time was a major Western ally. And that's why you can find this famous article that's gone viral recently that was published in The Independent, the British newspaper in the 90s, heroizing Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, as an anti-Soviet warrior, because at that time, he was a Western ally fighting against the Soviet Union. So fast forward to Syria, here we have the CIA funding these so-called rebels, many of which were actually allied with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. ISIS emerges out of both the US invasion and occupation of Iraq and the Syria war. ISIS originated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then it became the Islamic State of Iraq, and then it spread into Syria because of the chaos, because of this US-backed proxy war in Syria. And then the US National Security Advisor today, Jake Sullivan, who was previously the top aide of Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. In 2012, Jake Sullivan published an email that we have thanks to WikiLeaks. In this email to his boss, Hillary Clinton, he admitted, quote, AQ is on our side in Syria, end quote. AQ is, of course, Al-Qaeda. So this was an acknowledgement by one of the most prominent U.S. officials that the U.S. has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for a decade, just as the U.S. helped to give birth to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And now, of course, there are many other details we can talk about, but to fast forward, that proxy war in Syria started in 2011, and it went on for years. Eventually, the Syrian government, with the support of Iran and Russia, and also the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah, which they did help the Syrian government at the request of the Syrian government. This, according to international law, this was legal intervention because it was requested by the sovereign government of Syria, whereas the intervention by the U.S. and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, which all intervene in Syria, that was illegal according to international law. They were trying to overthrow an internationally recognized sovereign government. Well, what happened is in 2016, the Syrian government, with the support of Russia and Iran, was able to retake major cities like Aleppo, the second biggest city, and it never lost Damascus, the capital, but it was it was able to retake the major cities. So in response, that phase of the war was a failure. So the US and the EU imposed suffocating sanctions, an economic blockade on Syria to try to crush the country. And they succeeded. I mean, they were unable to win militarily, so they just destroyed the economy. They caused hyperinflation. People who worked for the government saw their wages decline so rapidly that they ended up making at exchange rates like $30 a month. I mean, not over 90% of Syrians were living in poverty, according to the top UN expert on sanctions. And she said, this UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, Alina Duhan, she said that the West is suffocating Syria economically. That's what she said. She said it was outrageous what was going on. They suffocated the Syrian economy. It led to basically state collapse. A top US official admitted that the goal was to prevent Syria from rebuilding. That was the stated policy, to prevent Syria from getting access to foreign currency. Meanwhile, the US military, for nearly a decade now, has been militarily occupying 1/3 of Syrian territory in the east, which is where the oil fields are located, preventing the Syrian government from getting access to its oil, which prevented it from getting oil revenue to try to starve the country economically, which fueled this inflation crisis. There was a food shortage because Syria wasn't able to import food. And given that situation, given the desperation, given the poverty, the government lost support. And then you saw this attack that started in November this year, 2024. And these foreign-backed groups, backed by the US, by Israel, by Turkey, they launched an attack. And Russia has been tied down in Ukraine. Hezbollah has not been defeated, but it's been dealt a significant blow by Israel and Lebanon. So they were not able to support Syria. And clearly, a lot of people didn't want to fight. A lot of people in the Syrian army, again, their salaries are like $30 a month. They're not going to sacrifice their lives for that. And we basically saw the state collapse. And now the group that basically is in charge of the Syrian government is rebranded Al-Qaeda. It's called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, it was previously the Al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the leader of this group, that's the de facto new leader of Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, also known as Ahmad al-Shara, he was the former, in scare quotes, leader of Syrian Al-Qaeda. Literally, he was the leader of Al-Qaeda, and now he's in charge of Syria de facto with Western support. Israel has colonized more Syrian land. The U.S. is directly in communication with them. It's going to end its terrorist designation of them. And they have refused to fight Israel as Israel has colonized more land and destroyed all of Syria's defense capabilities. And meanwhile, the U.S. is colonizing 1/3 of Syria. Israel is colonizing more land, and Turkey in the north is colonizing more land. So it's a complete failed state. It's being carved up. It's very similar to what happened in Libya in 2011. So just as Libya had been one of the most prosperous, it had been the most prosperous country in all of Africa, and is now a failed state. Similarly, Syria had previously been an oasis of stability. Before 2011, it was known for being a very prosperous country. People had healthcare and education, very low rates of crime and violence, very safe. A lot of foreigners went there to study Arabic. I have friends who went to study Arabic in Damascus. And it was also very moderate. Women had very high levels of equality and representation and rights. It was a multicultural country with different religious and ethnic groups living together in relative peace. And it's basically been destroyed. It's very sad.
Right. So, I mean, considering that history seems to be repeating itself in a number of different ways, you mentioned about Osama bin Laden being celebrated as this anti-Soviet warrior. I see that they are trying to rebrand HTS and even potentially take them off of the terrorist list. Is that just a short-term thing, though? Have they more or less outlived their usefulness now? And now they're going to have to watch out, because inevitably they're going to be coming after them. America and Israel will be coming after them next. What do you think will unfold there?
Well, no one knows, of course. I should say that HTS has made it very clear they don't want any conflict with Israel. They said that. The leader of HTS, the former leader of Al-Qaeda, gave a speech in which he said, "We have no issues with Israel. We don't want a conflict with Israel." Meanwhile, Israel is, of course, committing genocide in Gaza. It's facing charges of genocide at the International Court of Justice. Netanyahu and the former defense minister Gallant are facing charges of crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. I mean, top UN experts have said clearly they're committing genocide. Amnesty International, as mainstream of a human rights organization as it gets, says Israel's committing genocide. So meanwhile, the Syrian so-called rebels say, oh, we want peace with Israel. We don't want any conflict with Israel. So I think Israel's fine with them. The US is fine with them as well. But the real question is, can they actually hold on to power? Because let's not forget what happened in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan in the 70s, the people had a revolution. They had a socialist revolution. And then the US began supporting the Mujahideen, like the Contras in Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution in the 80s. And then, well, the revolution was in 79, and then the Contras were back in the 80s. So very similar time period for Afghanistan and Nicaragua. So in the 80s, in response to the US-backed Mujahideen, the Soviet Union intervenes in Afghanistan at the request of the internationally recognized Afghan government. It asked for their help, just like Syria asked for Russia's help. The Soviet Union intervenes to fight against these CIA-backed extremists in the Mujahideen who are busy beheading teachers. For instance, the Mujahideen, one of the leaders, Hekmatyar, who was backed by the CIA, he was infamous for throwing acid in the face of women teachers because he thought that women should not be allowed to be teachers in schools. Because previously Afghanistan had been relatively moderate and allowed women to have equality and be teachers and play other roles in society. And he said, no, they should only be in their home. So he threw acid in their faces. And this is one of the CIA's main so-called moderate rebel leaders, right, in Afghanistan. So after eventually they win, the CIA wins in Afghanistan, the extremists in the Mujahideen win, the Soviets withdraw, the Afghan socialist government falls. And then what happens? There's a civil war that continues for years. And eventually the Taliban, through its brutality, rises to the top. And they're able to defeat the other groups and unify the country relatively and exercise some kind of authority. So what we're seeing in Syria, of course, this is a war that's been going on now for 13 years. So maybe at this point, a lot of the groups are already exhausted and they'll accept HTS's authority. However, there's also the very real possibility that the war will continue. There are other gangs and warlords and rebel groups that are fighting for their own turf in Syria, and they may decide they don't want to go along with HTS. There are other parts of Syria that are under the control of different rebel groups, like in the south, in the east. Technically, the U.S. claims that ISIS still exists, even though ISIS has been destroyed. Maybe there are some gangs in like small little towns in the middle of nowhere where almost no one lives in the desert, and they can claim that they're ISIS, and the U.S. uses that as an excuse to justify continued occupation. But ISIS's imaginary so-called caliphate has been destroyed. They no longer control major cities like they previously controlled Deir ez-Zor in Syria, and they controlled Mosul in Iraq. And they don't anymore. But the point is that Syria is a big country, and most of the population lives in the big cities, but there are a lot of smaller areas, especially in the desert, that have very small towns, and maybe there are some, gangs and warlords who control these areas. So there could be continued violence. Maybe the HTS leader Al-Julani is killed. Who knows? I mean, I don't know how good his security is, but he better have good security because there are a lot of people with guns because the CIA flooded that country with billions of dollars of weapons. So even if the US and Israel want HTS to stay in power, there's no guarantee that they'll stay alive. They could fragment. And then another possibility is that you mentioned that HTS has been rebranding. This is part of a clear Western-backed campaign. It goes back years where the US media has been helping Julani to rebrand. Different US media outlets. CNN published a hilarious interview with him that was something like from radical jihadist to blazer-wearing revolutionary. I mean, it's absurd.
Right.
So
and they have the diversity-friendly jihads also. They're
oh
that's
yeah,
being published as well.
yeah, that was in the British media. Diversity-friendly jihadist.
Right.
And
Well,
yeah,
is he? I mean, so the main thing you're talking about the graphic nature of what Israel is doing, and here we have HTS saying that they're pretty much supportive of Israel. They've also said that they won't allow any anti-Israel attacks to be launched from Syria. What is it that's causing them to be this friendly towards Israel? Is it because they know that their success is in part from the U.S. and Israel's support, or is it also potentially a matter of self-preservation, that they know that if they go up against these two powers, they have very little chance of staying in power?
It's both, and it's ideological. One, it's because the U.S. and Israel have supported these groups for years. I mentioned, the CIA operation, which was called Operation Timber Sycamore, but Israel also admitted, the chief of the IDF admitted that for years they have been arming the so-called rebels in Syria, and there have been reports in the Israeli media admitting that Israel was treating Al-Qaeda members, literal Al-Qaeda members. So in Syria, they were fighting against the Assad government. They would get wounded. The Al-Qaeda members would cross over into Israel. Israel would
The
treat
Golan
them
Heights,
for
right?
free in its hospitals and then send them back into Syria to fight against the Assad government. Of course, the Syrian government was allied with Iran, and it supported the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance against Israeli colonialism. So Israel saw Syria as one of its main adversaries. This is why Netanyahu has boasted publicly. He said, "We played a significant role in helping to overthrow the Syrian government." He says it. He's proud of it. Meanwhile, he says that this is a major blow to the axis of resistance. He boasted of that. In fact, Netanyahu just visited Mount Hermon, the tallest mountain in Syria, which has been occupied by Israel. They've taken it over and made it clear that they have no plans of leaving this territory in Syria they've occupied. So there's that part of it. There's also self-preservation. I mean, these groups, which by definition are mercenaries, I mean, they know that they can't take on the U.S. and Israel. The reason they were able to take power is because they had the support of the U.S. and Israel and Turkey and the Gulf monarchies. And then finally, there's the ideological element. These groups are Salafi jihadists. They're a very extreme form of Sunni Islam. Now, obviously, the vast majority of Sunni Muslims on earth do not agree with their ideology. Most Sunni Muslims do not share, they're not Salafi jihadists, right? But these kinds of extreme Salafi jihadists, they see Shia Muslims as their main adversaries. This is what a lot of people don't understand. The main victims of ISIS and their terror attacks have not been, well, actually, a lot of the main victims have been other Sunni Muslims, by the way. some of the main targets. But the other target has been Shia Muslims. Obviously, ISIS and Al-Qaeda have committed horrible crimes against Christians and Druze and other religious minorities. But the main victims have been other Muslims, have been Sunni Muslims who don't agree with their extremist views, and especially Shia Muslims. They see Shia as their main adversaries. And Iran is a Shia majority country, and Iran's government is influenced by Shia Islam. So the extremists in Syria have said openly, our main enemy is Iran. They said that. And that's why the US and Israel have also seen them as loyal proxies, because they're fighting against Iran. They're fighting against Hezbollah. They're fighting against Russia, which are, of course, the main adversaries of the US and Israel in the region. So again, they've served a lot of different interests. Now, I was going to say another quick point. We don't even know if they'll be able to hold on to power given the instability in Syria and if there'll be more civil war. But there's another possibility, which I think is likely. So if they are able to hold on to power, in the short term, they're trying to rebrand for a Western audience, right? They're trying to get removed from the US terrorism list. And the UK has already sent them 50 million pounds in aid, which is material support for terrorism. But so that's part of the rebranding campaign. And they've said, we're going to respect the rights of religious minorities like Christians and Druze. For people who don't know, Druze, not to be confused with Jews, Druze, Druze. It's a religious minority, especially in Syria. It's one of the biggest communities in the world is in Syria, and they've been repressed a lot by these groups, these extremist Salafi jihadist groups. So in the short term, they say that they're respecting the rights of these religious groups. And they also claim that they want to unify the country and all this. But I think that's a short-term cynical propaganda narrative. We all know that the attention span for these kinds of things is very short. I think in a few months, most people outside of Syria will forget about what's going on in Syria. Certainly in the Western media, in a few months, no one will talk about Syria anymore, especially after Trump comes in and all the chaos happens in the US. So I think that in the short term, they're using all this rhetoric. But in a few months, they'll probably go back to their very extreme ideology. And also another factor to consider is that if Julani, who again was the leader of Al Qaeda, if he does not return to some of these extreme, policies that he pledged to his supporters, they probably will just kill him. They'll say you're disobeying what you claim you were going to do, and you're serving the foreign enemies of Islam or whatever, and they'll kill him. So I think regardless, Syria is heading for years of major instability. It's very sad.
So to kind of recap the different players who are involved here, then. So we have the U.S. and Israel who are involved because of the Palestinian resistance element, and obviously the U.S. follows along with. I mean, it seems like Israel almost makes U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for them. You have, I would imagine you would also have, similar to Libya, some economic interests from the U.S. side. You were talking about pipelines and potentially, if it's like Libya, where it looked like they wanted them to capitulate to the Western economic models. I'm not sure if that plays an element. You've also got Russia in there, but who was there by invitation. You have these rebel groups who obviously they weren't doing this only because they were supported and funded by the West. It looks like that they want power. They want to set up their own caliphate, it seems. You can correct me if I'm wrong after this. And then finally, Turkey. And then what is Turkey's interest? Is it also a land grab? What's their motive here?
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the Israel question. So I don't agree with people who say that, Israel is controlling U.S. policy. Israel has Netanyahu himself, who, by the way, is an American. Netanyahu spent the most formative years of his life growing up in the U.S., being educated in the U.S. He said openly, "We are an American aircraft carrier." He actually said that. And famously, the former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig also said Israel is the biggest, most important unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. And Biden himself has repeatedly said Israel is the best investment we make. And if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create an Israel. Think about Israel's geostrategic location. It's one of the most strategically located countries on earth, right there on the Mediterranean, going into West Asia, into one of the most strategic regions of the world with numerous geostrategic choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, going into the Bab al-Mandab Strait, going into the Suez Canal. I mean, this is such an important region. Half of the world's top oil and gas producers are located in this region. The U.S. needs control over this region to stabilize the global oil and gas market, especially after the 1973 oil crisis, when OPEC, at that time, Saudi Arabia was slightly more independent of the U.S., and the OPEC oil lockout, the embargo of the West in protest over Israel's occupation of Palestinian and Syrian and Egyptian territory. In response to that, it caused not hyperinflation. It caused a serious inflation crisis in the West. And this was one of the biggest reasons for the creation of the petrodollar system in 1974, the overthrow of the killing of the Saudi king. So, I mean, the real possibility, this is why OPEC was tamed, right? Like, the U.S. really needs, it's not necessarily that the U.S. needs the oil. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of oil, but the U.S. needs control over the price of oil in the global market and the price of gas. And these are the swing states in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, which has all of this excess capacity. And Saudi Aramco is very political. They can choose to increase or decrease oil production based on geopolitical concerns rather than just their economic needs. So the U.S. needs a foothold in the region in order to control the region, especially at a time like today, because who's the largest trading partner of most of the countries in the region? It's not the US, it's China. China is not only the largest trading partner, China is the largest purchaser of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf. So this is why countries like Saudi Arabia, that have historically been very loyal US client regimes, have tried to move a little bit more in the non-aligned direction, even joining BRICS, because China is their main trading partner, and they can see that China is growing, and over time will be more important to them. So the U.S. really needs a way to maintain its control over the region, and Israel is that outpost they use to exercise control over the entire region. But actually, historically, there have been important times in history where the U.S. and Israel have been on the opposite sides of issues, especially the Suez crisis in the 1950s, whatever. There are other examples as well. But the point is that it's not just about Israel, it's also about Iran. Iran had historically been what was known as one of the twin pillars of the U.S. West Asia strategy, Middle East, West Asia, right? So previously, going into the Nixon administration, the U.S. State Department talked about its so-called twin pillar strategy. The Western pillar was Saudi Arabia, and the Eastern pillar was Iran, which were both run by U.S.-backed monarchies, including the Shah in Iran, another U.S.-backed dictator. They don't care about democracy. And these were the countries that the U.S. used along with Israel to help exercise control over the region. In 1979, the U.S. lost the Eastern pillar because of the Iranian Revolution, which was a huge blow. Iran is a massive country, a major economy with a big population. It's a major regional player. It has an advanced military. It has significant manufacturing potential. And Iran has been supporting the resistance forces in the region. So the U.S. really has been desperate to try to overthrow the Iranian government. That's why they've been imposing brutal sanctions for decades to try to suffocate the Iranian economy. And the former U.S. general and NATO commander, Wesley Clark, he famously revealed that the U.S., after 9/11, had plans to overthrow 7 governments in West Asia and North Africa. And those were,
Original timeline of 5 years, right?
yeah, 5 years. It took them much longer than 5 years,
Yeah.
right? But they actually succeeded in 6 of those 7. Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and I'm skipping one. But the point is that they succeeded in all of those. So,
Right.
and here we are today. So that was the first part of your question about Israel. The second part about Turkey. So what are Turkey's interests? A few things. Historically, Syria had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and Erdogan kind of has these neo-Ottoman ambitions. He wants Turkey to be a major power, so he's been trying to look to expand Turkish influence in numerous parts of the region. We are also talking about Libya. So Turkey has become a major player in Libya after the NATO war destroyed Libya. So also, there's an ideological element. So Turkey is governed by what is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood. Erdogan's party, the AKP, it comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood had seen Arab nationalism as one of its main adversaries, especially Baathism in Syria and Iraq. And previously in the 80s, there was a very similar attempt to overthrow the Arab nationalist government in Syria led by Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad. And the CIA also backed this operation. There are documents from the US that show that the US was using the Muslim Brotherhood in the 80s in places like Hama to try to overthrow Hafez al-Assad and install a pro-Western regime. So there's that ideological element. There's also the geopolitics of it, which is that Turkey and Syria have had a lot of conflicts over the years, especially over the question of Kurds. So there are a lot of Kurds in southern Turkey, and there are a lot of Kurds in eastern Syria, and there are also Kurds in western Iraq, and there are Kurds in western Iran. So there are a lot of Kurdish communities that some of which are involved in political groups that have fought wars against these governments, especially in Turkey. So in the case of Turkey, there are groups like the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which is a leftist kind of Maoist-inspired Kurdish group that has originally they fought for independence from Turkey, and they have since abandoned that. They've kind of turned more towards anarchism. And as they turned toward anarchism, they also kind of allied with the US and they abandoned Marxism, and they're a weird group. But the point is that Turkey sees them as one of its main competitors, one of its main adversaries. And in the south of Turkey, they have carried out attacks against Turkish security forces. So in Syria, on the other hand, Turkey, historically, going back to Camel Ataturk, they really repressed the rights of Kurds inside Turkey and repressed their rights to speak Kurdish and their separate identity, saying that they're all Turks. In Syria, it was very different. Even though Syria was governed by an Arab nationalist party, they allowed Kurds to have more rights and autonomy and to speak their language and such. And so Kurds in Syria had much more equality than in Turkey. And Syria also allowed some of these Turkish armed groups to operate. So the leader of the PKK, Öcalan, was actually spending a lot of time previously living in Damascus in Syria, and there were allegations that they got support from the Syrian government. So Turkey and Syria have this kind of long-standing geopolitical rivalry. And finally, there is the element of pipelines, which again, I'm not saying that it's the only factor, but it is a factor. So Turkey and Qatar had made plans going back over almost 20 years now to at least 2009 that we know of, that were publicly revealed, that Qatar and Turkey were trying to make a pipeline that would go through the middle of Syria. But Syria instead was talking with Iran and Russia about creating a competing pipeline that, of course, was opposed by the US. So again, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that is a
Right.
factor that Syria had opposed this plan to create a pipeline that would go into Europe. And again, Europe wanted this because they wanted to reduce their reliance on Russian gas. Now, finally, this gets to your
Okay.
other question about natural resources. Now, Syria doesn't have a lot of natural resources like Libya. Libya has a lot of oil. Syria does have oil, but it's not a major producer of oil. The reason that oil is important is because the Syrian government had used oil exports to get access to foreign currency that it needed to pay for imports, that it needed to pay for technology, capital goods, and other energy, food, because it's not entirely food sovereign. Like many countries in the region rely on importing food, especially considering that a lot of Syria is desert. You can't grow food in the desert. So it's not necessarily like Libya. Like no one really needs Syria's oil necessarily, but the U.S. was able to use that as a geopolitical weapon to starve Syria of revenue, which succeeded. But it's also about Syria's geostrategic location, being right in the heart of West Asia. And again, like if the US wants to try to weaken Iran and destroy the axis of resistance, Syria is physically located in the center of the land route between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. So by breaking off Syria, they're cutting out one of the important parts of the resistance.
Right. Okay. So to wrap up one of the previous points, so with Israel, your position is more that Israel doesn't set the U.S. foreign policy, but U.S. foreign policy by nature is set in favor of Israel because of the U.S. own self interest in the region.
Yeah,
Um,
and before the 1960s, the US and Israel were on the opposite sides of several major issues because at that time, Israel was not as strategic to the US. But since especially the 67 war and the 73 Yom Kippur war, since the 70s, Israel has been very firmly allied with the US because their geostrategic interests have firmly aligned, and especially after the Iranian Revolution. Since the 80s and the rise of Likud, I mean, Israel is very complicated. Previously, it had the Labor Party that was in power that was more closely allied with Europe, but since the 80s, I mean, Israel is just very firmly as pro-US as it gets.
right. Okay. It's interesting hearing the other part about the oil as well, that they don't have an incredible amount of oil. And it kind of makes me rethink. I once used to celebrate the honesty of Trump when he was talking about leaving troops in Syria for the oil. He said, "We like oil. We want the oil." And I like that transparency. Even Assad himself said this is one of the best presidents we could hope for. He just says it directly. He doesn't pretend like other Nobel Peace Prize winning presidents that go around and bomb people around the world. But it sounds like that's not exactly 100% honest either. Sure, yeah, they're getting the oil, but it wasn't so much that they really needed or wanted that oil, but it was more that they needed to keep it out of the hands of Assad so that they could accelerate his fall. So that's kind of interesting. With the Turks also, and their interest. There's a China element too, isn't there? Because ETIM, a lot of the Uyghur fighters who had been had turned towards extremism, were imported through Turkey and were ironically fighting. This is ironic too, because they're fighting the Kurds and displacing the Kurds in Syria who want independence from Turkey, while they're apparently this group who's pushing for independence from China. There's an irony there, but that's a big element too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so as you know very well, China has a very hands-off foreign policy. The Chinese position is they don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of foreign countries. They want to have good relations with everyone. So China had strongly supported the Syrian government, But this is why some people who don't really understand China have been angry. Like, why isn't China doing anything? China doesn't interfere. That's it. It allows countries to deal with their own issues. What China is concerned about is they, of course, are concerned about their own security and with extremist groups that have carried out attacks against the Chinese state, especially in Western China, in Xinjiang. And the US has a long history of supporting these extremist separatist groups. This has been admitted by mainstream media outlets that the CIA, for instance, had spent years and many millions of dollars supporting Tibetan extremist separatist groups. The Dalai Lama was being funded by the CIA. And the US has also supported separatist groups, of course, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and Xinjiang. It's part of the US strategy to try to break up China, right? Well, so a lot of these extremist groups had gotten support from elements in Turkey and also in Syria and had been fighting in Syria. So, in that sense, of course, China was very concerned, but China was not like there's this propaganda in the Western media. You'll sometimes see that they claim that supposedly China and Cuba had troops in Syria. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but this is one of these like neocon fantasies. They're like Chinese troops are propping up Bashar al-Assad. No, that's not how China works.
Yeah.
But obviously, this is a concern that they have had, and that was one of the reasons that they were supporting the Syrian government. And now that the Syrian government has fallen, we see that the so-called Turkestan Islamic Party, which is a renamed version of the ETIM, which the U.S. government claimed didn't exist. In 2020, the Trump administration, under the State Department of Mike Pompeo, ended the terrorism designation for ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, claiming that there was no evidence that it exists. Well, it changed names. It's the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is affiliated with Al Qaeda and has been very active in Syria. And after the overthrow of Assad, they published this video in Syria saying that they're declaring war on China and they're going to try to liberate, that is, have a secessionist war in Western China, which is absurd. So obviously, yeah, I mean, that's something that China is concerned about. And I know that this is something that China and Turkey have had debates about, that this has been a serious point of tension in their diplomatic relations. But again, as we know, it's not China's modus operandi to interfere in other countries. So instead, they tend to try to make deals with existing governments to try to, so those other governments in their own sovereign territory can deal with these kinds of extremist groups. So I guarantee you that China and Turkey, this is like a major issue whenever they have conversations, and this is probably something that is really angering China.
Yeah, I mean, I can empathize with people who would wish, now that they know that the evil that's going to be unleashed, they would wish that China would have done something. But the whole draw to China, the whole reason that they're making such headway, especially in the global south, is because they don't interfere. This is just their philosophy.
Exactly.
This is, if we are going to be moving into a unipolar world, multipolar world, finally, to have that other power not interfere with other countries is exactly what we need, because we've had too much of that for too long. So, it's going to be interesting too, because Canada launched a program to bring in 10,000 Uyghurs from overseas, Uyghur refugees. It's been about 1 or 2 years since it was approved, where they could start bringing them over. And to date, I think last week, they found one. They found one guy to bring over. I mean, there's no refugee crisis from Xinjiang into the bordering countries. But what you do have is you have these extremists in Syria who have now completed their mission. So it'll be interesting to see. Now they have an increased pool of Uyghurs who can go over, who are battle-hardened terrorists. And this doesn't usually end well for people. I mean, the UK was supporting terrorists to go and fight against Gaddafi. And when they came home, they did things like the Manchester bombing. What's going to be interesting to see now is that because first of all, it was ETIM doesn't exist. Now it's ETIM exists and they're going to go attack China, which some people are happy about. But when and if they start carrying out terrorist attacks in the West or in other countries, like they did in Thailand, they carried out terrorist attacks in Thailand. It will be interesting to see how quick the narrative changes to not that China was cracking down on extremism or this fake extremism, but that China is a net exporter of terrorism and they didn't do enough to protect us. I can just see the headlines now. It's really predictable what's going to happen. I don't want to stay too much on the ETIM talk.
One quick point. I mean, there's a possibility, but at the same time, I think we should also shouldn't inflate the threat there. I mean, obviously, this is something that China is concerned about, but this is also the people who are saying, like, why didn't China interfere? I agree 100% with what you said, that China is deeply ideologically committed to non-interference, to non-intervention. And that's one of the reasons that its influence has been growing in the global south. And a lot of people see it as a responsible partner, unlike the US, which interferes everywhere. But also, I mean, so yeah, clearly for propaganda reasons, these extremist groups in Syria are going to exploit this advantage to do PR. But how are they realistically going to cross over into China? I mean, look at a map. I mean, like, okay, so they're in Syria, so they would have to cross. I mean, and maybe they can try to fly, but where are they going to fly to? Like, I know China has been working a lot with Central Asian governments like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to crack down on extremists. So I think that it's unlikely they'll be able to fly from Syria, or maybe they go from Syria to Turkey and then Turkey to Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan. But even then, that's difficult. And if they try to do if they try to cross land, we're talking about many thousands of kilometers. They would have to go through
Right.
Iraq and then through Iran. Iran is not going to let them go through. Let's say they somehow go through the Caspian and go through Turkmenistan. They'd have to go through Afghanistan. And I know Afghanistan would be a potential area where obviously, the Taliban's in power and it's a kind of weak state. And there are a lot of areas maybe they could go through and smuggle through Afghanistan. But I do know that China and Afghanistan, China and the Taliban government, because they're in power, I mean, you have to deal with them. They're the real government. China and the Taliban have been working on this because Afghanistan understands that for China, this is a major security issue. So, I'm not saying it's not a threat, but I think the people in China are probably not that worried because Syria is still pretty far away. Like,
Yeah, it is.
it's much
I
more
mean, I think that,
difficult. You can make
yeah.
a video saying we're coming for you, China, but I mean, how are you going to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unlikely. I think I was speaking to a terrorism expert here, and they was talking about, if they were to change their identity and get a Turkish passport, it might become a little bit more difficult, but it's still not impossible, and it still would be quite difficult for them. The bigger risk is where these fighters who have been trained since childhood. There's videos of them literally training in ISIS camps as children. The risk is to the West when they get redispersed elsewhere if they're kind of just finished and say, okay, we're ready for something new now. Um, I want to. So we talked about the different players involved, and obviously Russia has a little bit of a different philosophy than China because Russia was involved for a certain period of time. They don't have the same level of non-interventionist policy that China has. So what was it that? Of course, he was invited by the government, but why would Russia go there? Why would Russia spend money on this? I mean, I know you mentioned they had a competing pipeline, but I can't imagine that's the only reason. What's their motive to say yes, we will come and help you?
A few reasons: geopolitics, historical political ties, and Russia has a major military base in Latakia, which is very important because it's also warm water, whereas a lot of Russia's the naval fleets are located at cold water ports. So this was very strategic for Russia. And we'll see. I think it's very likely that these, rebranded Al Qaeda rebels are going to try to push out the Russians. Right now, they're trying not to cause another war with Russia. So they haven't officially said that yet, but they're probably going to try to close the Russian Latakia base. So there's that element. Historically, Syria had been a close ally of the Soviet Union. During the first Cold War, the Ba'athist government of first Assad's father, Hafez, was very closely allied with the Soviet Union. And then after the end of the Soviet Union, Syria has been a close ally of the Russian Federation. So there are those political ties going back historically. the the Soviet Union and Russia historically did not have good ties with most countries in the region. So Syria was very important for them. So for instance, the Soviet Union and Israel had very bad relations. The Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia basically had no relations whatsoever. And the Soviet Union's position was that Saudi Arabia and Israel are puppets of US imperialism. That was what they said. And the Soviet Union had bad relations with the Jordanian monarchy, which is a U.S. puppet. I mean, and then until the Iranian Revolution, they didn't have very good relations with Iran either. So historically, the Soviet Union and then Russia only had a few major allies. They were Egypt, Syria, Iraq. So they were the secular Arab nationalist countries, whereas the US was allied with the theocratic monarchies. What a coincidence,
Right.
right? So that's important for Russia. It is true that in recent years, Russia's relations have improved with some of the countries in the region, especially with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's a very new development because, again, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for decades, basically, they were just US client regimes, but they've actually moved a little bit into the more non-aligned camp. That's why they've expressed interest in BRICS, and the UAE is trying to be this new Switzerland. Like Switzerland has abandoned the pretense that it's independent. We know it's not neutral. Everyone knows Switzerland is very much part of the larger European bloc. It's joined the sanctions against Russia. So the UAE is portraying itself as the new Switzerland, a new kind of neutral country. So Russia is trying to look for more allies in the region, and Syria was a very important ally. And so why did Russia not do more? I mean, they did a lot previously. Obviously, Russia is tied down in Ukraine, so it's not like they can send a lot more military support to Syria. They actually did send some planes initially when some of these extremists took over Aleppo. They were bombing some of these Al-Qaeda linked groups. But at the end of the day, Russia said, look, if the Syrian army is not going to fight, they've lost all their morale. People don't want to sacrifice their lives for $30 paychecks a month. The inflation crisis is horrible. Most people are living in poverty. When you lose your morale like that and people are not willing to fight, how can Russia just like prop up the government? They can't. So, I mean, Russia did a lot and they were obviously concerned about losing a major ally. But, at the end of the day, I guess it was pretty much inevitable.
So, how important was HTS's victory? How important was it that Russia was bogged down in Ukraine, or their support was waning, and or like what was the final straw that broke the camel's back? There's so many people involved here. What was the final thing that went wrong, or is it really hard to say a final thing? It's just a culmination of everything put together.
It was a culmination, I think. I mean, so we have to think about when you look at a map and you look at the territory of a country, especially when you have like a war situation and you have different groups controlling different territory. If you look at the map, it can be kind of misleading, right? Because most of the population is concentrated in the big cities or around the big cities. And especially with a country like Syria, where so much of the country is just desert, you look at a map and you're like, oh, wow, like, look, these rebel groups, they control so much territory, but a lot of it's just desert. So the Syrian government controlled the main cities. But even though it defeated a lot of these armed extremist groups and retook Aleppo, for instance, in 2016, it was never fully unified. I mentioned that the US has been militarily occupying the east. The US also has forces in the southern border in what's called a Tanth. So, like, even though the war, people thought the war ended several years ago, it was kind of just frozen. And basically, what happened is that life was carrying on in the main cities, but these groups, especially in the northern province of Idlib, Idlib was governed by Al-Qaeda, by rebranded Al-Qaeda. So Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded. Originally, it was called Jabhat Fatah Sham, and then it rebranded again as Hayat Tahrir Sham. And they were the government of Idlib, and they were governing it like Afghanistan. They stoned women to death on accusations of adultery. But they were backed by Turkey, and there was basically a deal where when the Syrian government, with the backing of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, when they defeated these extremist groups, they defeated ISIS, they defeated Al-Qaeda, and these rebels were forced to leave the main cities. What happened? They all went to Idlib, basically. So Idlib had basically been this major hub for Salafi jihadists, full of many hundreds of thousands of hardened fighters. And they never put down their guns. They were just waiting there, and no one knew how it was going to end. And Russia and Iran and Turkey had a series of agreements, the Astana agreements, where they were trying to figure out what to do. And basically, they just kept kicking the can down the road. So even though it looked like the war was over, it was just frozen for years. And then eventually, I think for a variety of reasons. One, because of Israel's war in Gaza and its war in Lebanon. It's not a coincidence that the day that Israel signed its so-called ceasefire with Lebanon is the day that these rebranded Al-Qaeda so-called rebels launched their attack again from Idlib. That they launched it from Idlib. That was their base of operations, right? So it's not a coincidence that happened on the same day, because Israel had done damage to Hezbollah. Now, Israel didn't defeat Hezbollah, but it did kill Hezbollah's leadership. It dealt damage to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was able to defend southern Lebanon, but they weren't able to deploy into Syria to help Syria. So that was one of Syria's main allies removed from the table. And then you also had Russia being tied down in Ukraine. So Russia wasn't able to provide as much support. So these foreign-backed, extremists in Syria, they saw this was the perfect moment. And I think, the US and Turkey or whoever, they told them now is the time. In fact, one of the main so-called rebel leaders told AFP, the French media outlet, he admitted that Turkey gave them the green light. He said that. So Turkey was like, go ahead, attack, take Aleppo. So again, it's not like the war never really ended. It's just there was temporarily Syria was able to retake this territory. But meanwhile, as I said earlier, even though Syria technically governed the main cities, it was not really able to govern because it had no money. It was under a horrible economic blockade that starved the country of foreign currency, that caused hyperinflation, that caused most people to live in poverty, a shortage of gasoline, a shortage of bread. I mean, there are all these videos for years of people waiting in line for hours to get gasoline. So life was it was hellish for most people. And even though the Syrian government technically had power, it wasn't able to exercise power, right? So this is something that, like, if you spent time in certain global south countries, you realize that you can have a government in power, but they don't hold real power, right? Like look at a government, like for instance, in Venezuela. Like the Venezuelan government is firmly the government in power, but the U.S. has been trying to overthrow that government, waging economic war, trying to crush the economy, backing extremist groups, carrying out violence. Like, just because you're the state doesn't mean that you control everything, right? So that's similar to what happened in Syria. Like, the grip on power was very weak. And eventually, I mean, what happened is they basically collapsed the state. That's what happened, is like people eventually, if your army loses morale and is not getting paid and is going hungry, no one's going to fight to protect the state, and then it collapses.
So the ultimate item was the economic sanctions and basically impoverishing them. That really was the key point. And it sounds like foreign intelligence agencies were in contact with these fighters to say when the perfect moment was. I mean, I was going to ask the question about how important was corruption, uh, government corruption in Syria to the fall of their government as well. But that just seems like it's an extension of poverty as well. I mean, I was watching some reports on some of these first stations where the jihadists came upon not having enough men because the other soldiers who were meant to be stationed there had bribed their way out of their positions. So I'd imagine this is a lot of this going on. I mean, I would imagine it goes up to Assad also. I don't know what to believe when it comes to the media in terms of what they're reporting on Assad, because it's going into hyperdrive. I've seen the CNN reporters in the most fake performances ever walking out with a guy from a prison which had been cleared, many days earlier, looking really good with a nicely trimmed beard, perfectly manicured nails, nice coat on, looking straight up at the sky after being in a dark cell for 3 months. And it's just crazy. But then I see other reports showing this garage full of luxury cars, Ferraris and everything like that. And they said it was Assad's. Maybe. I mean, he's probably corrupt also, but I don't know what to believe. But the corruption just seems like, I wouldn't imagine being able to fix corruption in an environment like that. When you have no money, when you are under attack by jihadists, it's not a time that you could potentially fix it. For all intents and purposes, I think it was 2011 before Syria looked like a properly functioning country, and Assad's wife was called the jewel of the desert. Assad was meeting with the queen. He was meeting with Western leaders who was praising the way that he was running Syria, and all of a sudden it went south, didn't it? I guess the corruption, like I said, is more of an extension of that impoverishment that was forced upon them.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the Western perception of Syria. There was an attempt, especially during the so-called War on Terror, to try to divide the different forces in the region and to divide the resistance axis, right? Because the war on terror was ostensibly, on paper, was supposedly against Al Qaeda, but in reality, in most conflicts, the US and Al Qaeda have been on the same side, right? In Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, against Iran. So, in most conflicts, they're allies. So, when the US declared the so called war on terror, they immediately used it as an excuse to go after resistance groups in the region that actually were fighting against ISIS. So, fighting against Al Qaeda, excuse me, that later fought against ISIS because ISIS existed later. So, as an example, Saddam Hussein, regardless of what you think about Saddam Hussein, he was one of the main enemies of Al Qaeda in the region. But the US tried to link him to Al Qaeda, which was one of the stupidest, most ridiculous propaganda campaigns ever. And then the US tried to go after the Palestinians, who were always very much against Al Qaeda. In fact, Al Qaeda has not only did Israel support Al Qaeda in Syria, but Al Qaeda has recently been criticizing Hamas and telling Hamas to release the hostages or prisoners of war. So, I mean, like, the US tried to use this as an excuse to go after all the resistance groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, that had nothing to do with Al Qaeda, that were against Al Qaeda. So, in the case of Syria and also Libya, there are some people who sometimes criticize Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Assad in Syria and claiming that supposedly they were allied with the West. That's completely false. And what happened is that after 9/11, these nationalist forces in the region, like Gaddafi and Assad, who were Arab nationalists, they saw this so-called war on terror and said, fine, if the US is actually going to fight Al Qaeda and these extremist groups, we will help them because we also are against Al Qaeda and these extremist groups. But then they realized that the US actually was not truly committed to fighting these extremist groups, that it was an excuse being used by the US to justify invading and overthrowing governments in the region. So the whole attempt, the US was trying to get Syria to cut its ties with Iran, to cut its ties with Russia, and to stop supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and resistance groups. And Syria said no. Syria said, we're going to continue supporting these groups up until the end. I mean, that's the reason that the Syrian government fell. If the Syrian government had abandoned support for Hezbollah, cut ties with Iran, cut ties with Russia, and recognized Israel, Assad would still be in power today. The reason he fell is because he refused to do all of those things, right? Okay, so there's that part, and the same thing with Libya and Gaddafi, right? Okay, another point what you mentioned about corruption. This is obviously a complicated issue. Yes, there was clearly corruption, but why was there so much corruption? There's corruption everywhere. The U.S. is one of the most corrupt countries on earth, by the way. Look at how many U.S. Congress members are outperforming the S&P 500 by 100%. I mean, it's incredible how much insider trading there's going on. U.S. senators like Bob Menendez are literally being bribed with gold bars by foreign countries. I mean, it's a joke. The U.S. is very corrupt. Not to mention the legal corruption, in scare quotes, through campaign contributions. Now, according to the U.S. Supreme Court and Citizens United, there's no limit on how much corporations can donate because corporations are people. So, I mean, the U.S. is so corrupt. Obviously, there's corruption going on in a lot of countries. However, when you have a war, corruption tends to increase significantly. And when you're under brutal sanctions and suffering an economic crisis, corruption increases significantly. So this is true for many countries. So, like, look, in Venezuela, there's all this propaganda saying Venezuela is so corrupt. And I mean, there is corruption in Venezuela. There's corruption across Latin America. But one of the reasons that corruption has gotten worse is because of the sanctions. It's one of the main reasons. Because, for instance, because the U.S. sanctions and economic blockade, which Trump, he openly called it an embargo. The U.S. has a brutal economic blockade in Venezuela, like the blockade of Cuba. And when that happens, it caused hyperinflation. Venezuela was unable to export its oil. This is a country that's a petrostate. It's been a petrostate for 100 years before Hugo Chavez was even born. And Venezuela relied on exporting oil and using that revenue to fund imports, to import food. They imported the majority of their food. They imported energy. They imported oil. Even though they have a lot of oil, it's very heavy oil, right? It needs to be processed. They exported the crude oil. It was processed abroad. They imported the the gasoline. I mean, so this is a problem that goes back many decades in Venezuela. So the US suffocated the Venezuelan economy, caused hyperinflation. Government employees were getting paid, like in Syria, very low wages. So what happens? They get involved in corruption. Because if you're only getting paid $50 a month, obviously you're going to get involved in some corruption because you want to feed your family. This is exactly what happened in Syria, and especially in the army, right? Because first of all, why are you going to risk your life if one, you're not even getting paid basically anything, very little, and two, you're fighting against these hardened extremist Salafi jihadists who believe, like, they have an extreme ideology. They believe that they're fighting for the religious cause. You're just a guy who just joined the military because you thought it would be a good job. You're not going to put your life on the line, right? So in those kinds of situations, corruption flourishes. And then you have people who, of course, they're not going to risk their lives, so they'll bribe their way out of being conscripted into the military. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there was corruption, but we have to understand the systemic causes of that, which is it was a problem rooted in the economic asphyxiation of the country. Before 2011, as you mentioned, Syria was relatively one of the more prosperous countries. Obviously, it's not like the Gulf monarchies, which are deeply corrupt, and they're literal monarchies. Talk about corruption. What does it mean to be corrupt when your government in Saudi Arabia is just run by a family and they just give all their ministry positions to their cousins? But that's not called corruption because it's a monarchy. And then people say Syria is corrupt because, yeah, Assad, he was made president because his father was president. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of that. Like, I don't think they should do that. And then, yeah, the people say he gave his family members whatever positions and such. That's literally the government of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Qatar and Kuwait. But we don't hear the same rhetoric about them because they're allied with the West, right? So we have to understand why again, the corruption didn't come out of nowhere. And yeah, I'm sure that Assad lived very comfortably. He was the president of the country. I mean, I always find this so funny when people are like, "Do you see where Putin lives? Do you see his standard of living?" It's like, yeah, do you see Donald Trump's standard of living? He literally has golden toilets, literally golden toilets. Or even Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden just allowed his drug dealing son he just pardoned his son and took him out of prison. So I mean, like, obviously there's a very hypocritical double standard here.
Right. Yeah. Now, how do you reconcile the fact that after Assad fell, you see all of these videos of people in Syria celebrating and cheering? Is it just because they were so tired? Because I mean, they must know what comes next. I mean, there's a lot of brutality that comes next. There's a lot of unrest that comes next. Uh, Yet they're there celebrating. I don't know if it's just because they've lived under these sanctions for so long that maybe there's a chance something will change. You know, I'm reminded of a conversation I had this past weekend. I met this brilliant Lebanese professor of Marxism, and we were talking about this and some other things. And he told me, he says, you know, it's funny. Oftentimes you don't need to tell somebody to go to hell. They'll take them there themselves. And I don't know if like how do you square that anyways? When you see people celebrating in the streets, again, it might be selective footage by Western media. Like, how do you process that basically?
I mean, no government in the world is fully supported by their population. Even the most popular governments in the world, even if they have 90% approval, if they fall, you'll still have 10% of the population who will celebrate their fall, right? Of course, there are a lot of people in Syria who oppose the Syrian government. And I'm not saying, of course, not everyone who opposes the Syrian government is extremist, but there are also a lot of extremists who wanted to overthrow the Syrian government and who are celebrating its downfall. The same thing happened in Libya. And the irony is that even a lot of the people who celebrated Muammar Gaddafi's downfall in Libya have since said that they regretted it and now wish that Gaddafi was still in power or his government was allowed to stay intact. There's this famous interview, I think it was done by Vice News, which is hilarious because, you know, Vice is, regime change propaganda. But Vice, to their credit, they interviewed some of these former people in Libya who were involved in overthrowing the Libyan government backed by NATO in 2011. And they interviewed a guy who said, I took up arms against Gaddafi and I fought against him because I believed that he was a horrible dictator. And here we are today. We're living in chaos. The country's been destroyed. And he said, if we were back in 2011, I would pick up arms to defend Gaddafi. So,
Well,
and the thing is, like,
yeah.
I just want to make a quick point about this, which is that there's always this attempt in the Western media, which is so lazy, to personify everything in the leader, right? Everything's about Assad, everything's about Saddam Hussein, everything's about Gaddafi. It's much important to think about the structure of the state. Assad is a symbol for the Syrian government. Do people really think that Bashar al-Assad, who is trained as an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor, ophthalmologist, right? Do people really think that he was micromanaging all of the affairs of the Syrian state and the military? No. Like any country, the leadership, even if it's personified in this dictator, they still have other people who manage the affairs of the state, especially something like the military, the security forces. So Assad was really the symbolic figure that unified the Syrian state. And around him, you had the military was very powerful, the security services were very powerful, and other ministries, right? When that figure falls and the state collapses, like in Iraq, what you get is you just get state collapse and you get war and chaos. This is what happened in Libya. It's what happened in Syria. It's what happened in Iraq. It's not about like the individual dictator controlling everything. It's about the unity of the state. And when the unity of that state collapses, it's bad for the people of the country. I'm sorry. Like, you can say that it's defending authoritarianism or whatever infantile nonsense you want to say. But the real problem is not the fall of Assad as an individual. The problem is the collapse of the Syrian state, just like the problem was the collapse of the Libyan state and the collapse of the Iraqi state. And in all of these cases, chaos and violence has followed. And unfortunately, I think it's inevitable that the same thing will happen in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about in Libya the guy who regretted taking up arms against Gaddafi. The famous image of the guy who pulled down the statue in Iraq. Same thing. When he was asked afterwards, he says that was the biggest regret of his life. He had no idea what was to come. And of course, you have all of this atrocity propaganda that was set up beforehand in Syria. I mean, it's the same thing you saw in all of these other places, whether it be, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or the incubator babies earlier than that, or in Libya, the impending genocide in Benghazi, which was proven wrong as well. And then the Syrian chemical attack, which turned out to have a lot of issues with the narrative surrounding it. But even if the Western leftist anti-imperialist who believes some of these claims of atrocities, or even many of them, it's really interesting, and I wonder how you process it, to see so many people who are usually on board with us celebrating the fall of Assad, saying, yeah, what's coming, is probably going to be bad, but this was good. This had to happen. He had to go. Like, I mean, it just seems kind of, people that I'm closely connected to as well, it just seems incredibly short-sighted. I mean, even if they believe this was evil, the removal of this evil in their eyes has opened the gates to far greater evil. I don't know how you process it, and if you've seen some of these voices online of people who you considered comrades, or however you want to say it, kind of celebrating what happened. Like, what do you have to say to them, basically, and how do you process that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Syria was a very transformative conflict for me that really helped me politically mature and look past this kind of just frankly infantile Western politics that sees politics as good versus bad and doesn't understand basic geopolitics at all and doesn't understand the history of imperialism. I mean, in every single case of the West, led by the US, overthrowing one of these evil dictators, right? Then that's the narrative. We must overthrow the evil dictator. In every single case, the situation gets significantly worse after. But the problem is that people stop worrying about it. They stop thinking about it. They ignore what happened in Libya after 2011. And you can even see this in the Western media reporting. Or look at, for instance, one of the easiest ways to measure it is look at Google searches. In the lead up to 2011, in the lead up to the overthrow of Gaddafi, there was a huge increase in all of the Google searches for Libya. There was a massive increase in the Western media coverage. As soon as Gaddafi's overthrown, crickets. People stopped caring. The media stops reporting on it. Meanwhile, the country is in chaos still today. 13 years later, there's civil war. We don't know how many thousands of people have died. No one knows. There are literal slave markets, open air slave markets in Libya. In the case of Iraq, there was a little more coverage because the US military was there occupying the country. The US military is still there, by the way. But I mean, just look at what happened in Iraq. I mean, it's amazing how short-term people's memories are. Because I mean, I remember the Iraq invasion very vividly. It was for me the transformational political moment of my life. I was a teenager, and it was just like, I mean, for my generation, I feel like maybe a lot of people in my generation have already forgotten, but like that made me who I am. Like that was my first experience of what imperialism is. The US just blatantly invading a foreign country, destroying the state, literally destroying the state. I mean, not only did they bomb everything, the U.S. military, remember, the U.S. government had the policy of de-Baathification. You remember that term? Which meant anyone who was in the Ba'ath Party, which was the government of Iraq, was not allowed to be in the government. This means that everyone who had any technical or political experience, who knew how to run the Ministry of Health, who knew how to run the army, they were all fired. And that means that you just have people with no experience who are handpicked by the U.S. You had Paul Bremer, who didn't speak Arabic. He was an American with no experience in the region. He was made the dictator, basically, of Iraq. He was made the transitional leader of Iraq. I mean, it was crazy what they did. 1 million people died in Iraq. There are reports that say 1 million people died. It's like all of that has been flushed down the drain. People have forgotten. Obviously, that's not to say that Saddam Hussein didn't, oversee horrific atrocities. He did, especially against the Kurdish population. Like Saddam Hussein was very brutal. But the reality is that the situation after the fall of the Ba'athist government was way worse, and Iraq still has not recovered. And in the case of Syria, the Syrian government was notorious for torture. It's true. Like a lot of people were tortured by the Syrian government. But like, do you think that HTS rebranded Al Qaeda is not going to torture people? Do you think their human rights record is going to be better? Give me a break. It's a joke. You have to be realistic. You can't just look in politics like good versus bad. It's not how politics works. Politics is much more complicated. But unfortunately, in the West, there's just this simplistic understanding of democracy versus authoritarianism. And of course, Joe Biden, in his first State of the Union address, this is how he portrayed it. He said that in the world, it's a conflict between democracy versus authoritarianism. And when you see the world in that way, you just turn your brain off and you don't understand basic geopolitics. And it leads you to supporting these horrible wars that only make things worse, not better.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was really interesting when you were talking about the government workers from Iraq being disbanded and not being allowed into the new government. That was one of the best recruitment opportunities for ISIS also, because you had all of these security workers also who were trained in combat, who had nothing to do anymore. And that was just like a dream come true for ISIS. I mean, that was incredibly short-sighted. With Libya, when the interest dropped off, that's exactly like when you said there were literal people being put in cages and sold in open markets. Nobody was talking about it anymore. I don't know, with Iraq, maybe people think that it's a democracy now because they have a parliament and everything like that. But, after the U.S. had assassinated Soleimani on Iraqi soil without their permission, they voted that unanimously, their parliament voted for the U.S. to leave. And the U.S.'s official response was, no, sorry, we're staying. You need us. So much for a democracy. It is not a democracy there. So when it comes to Syria, I mean, I'm afraid that that's going to be the same thing that happens. But like, what do you think is going to happen to the ordinary Syrian people? Like, what's life going to be for them like now? I mean, we're already seeing some videos emerge of what these HTS fighters are doing to people in the streets and things like that. And again, they're probably holding back to a certain degree because there's a lot of cameras on them. I mean, I can only imagine once that inevitable drop off happens, like in Libya, all hell is going to break loose.
Yeah, I think that's a strategy. Like I said, if HTS can hold on to power, if there's not another civil war, if Jelani's not killed, I think that the strategies in the short term, for a few months, they'll portray themselves more moderately and try to win more support. They need to get removed from the terrorism list. They need the sanctions removed. I mean, to be honest, I mean, obviously, I do not support them in any way. But thinking of it from their perspective, their biggest concern is really getting the terrorism designation ended and getting the sanctions removed. Because if they want to actually govern, they know you can't govern when you're under an economic blockade by the U.S., which controls the global financial system, right? I mean, like, sanctions are economic war. And that's the main reason that the Syrian government ultimately fell. So if they want to actually govern, they have to get those sanctions removed. So they're going to portray themselves as more moderate. The U.S. will probably end the terrorism designation soon. And then the sanctions will probably be removed. People will stop focusing on them. As long as they obediently serve U.S. interests, they don't attack Israel, they instead focus on attacking Iran, the U.S. won't care if they become a new Afghanistan. Because let's not forget that when the Taliban originally took power, the Clinton administration immediately recognized the Taliban government and praised them for maintaining stability and bringing unity to Afghanistan.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I mean, for all of these people who don't see that this will happen, I'm talking about on our side, these anti-imperialists who are short-sightedly kind of celebrating the events that unfolded, even if they know that there's going to be challenges ahead. What are the implications to Palestinian resistance? I mean, I know that now one of their main allies here is gone, and also the events that unfolded took Palestinians out of the spotlight. I'm seeing just not as much stuff being shared about them, even though they're still undergoing the same horror they have been this entire time. So aside from the fact that they're starting to lose media interest, what is the full extent? Like, how hard of a hit is this to Palestinian resistance?
it's a hit. I mean, what I've been saying is that, there are some people, I think, who are being a little defeatist and saying this is the end of the axis of resistance. I think that's a little hyperbolic. It's a blow. It's a significant blow, but it's not the end. The resistance will continue. And a better way to say it is that they lost the battle, but they have not lost the war. The resistance forces, that is. So again, Syria was an important part of the axis of resistance. Also, simply geographically, Syria was located right in the heart of the land route from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon, into Palestine, just to physically send weapons and technology. But they'll still find ways around it, especially considering that, as I mentioned, Syria is not unified at all. There are a bunch of different gangs and warlords in foreign countries controlling different parts of Syria. The U.S. controls the east. Turkey controls the north. Now Israel controls the west. The rebranded Al-Qaeda rebels control some of the major cities. But, I mean, this is a big country. A lot of it's desert. Iran has they have experience in sending weapons through Iraq and through Syria into Lebanon. So they'll find ways to continue arming resistance groups. And then also, the axis of resistance, it ebbs and flows over time. So Hezbollah has not been defeated, despite the fact that Israel has dealt significant blows to Hezbollah. Hezbollah has prevented Israel from taking much territory in Lebanon. As recently as 2006, the last time Israel waged war on Lebanon and brutally bombed the south and bombed Beirut, the capital, Israel was able to march on. Israeli soldiers were able to march onto Beirut quite quickly. They haven't been able to do that this time. Hezbollah is much stronger today than it was 20 years ago, despite the massive blows dealt to it by Israel, which decapitated its leadership. They still have a lot of people in Lebanon who are willing to fight, because as long as Israel continues to occupy land of Palestinians, of Lebanese, of Syrians, they will keep fighting. As long as Israel continues to oppress the Palestinian people, they will keep fighting, because they are ideologically motivated, especially for the Palestinians. It's a matter of existence. You either fight or you're killed or you're ethnically cleansed. So even though the odds are against them, even though they're fighting against a regime, Israel, which is backed by the world's most powerful military and is given billions and billions of dollars of military support every year by the US. In Gaza, they're fighting with little homemade missiles. So, I mean, it's a matter of, in the West, the US loves to portray resistance groups in Palestine as so-called proxies of Iran. They're not proxies of Iran. In fact, Hamas politically has had differences with Iran, including on Syria. Now, Hamas is a complicated group. There's the Hamas armed wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, which is different from the Hamas political wing. The Hamas political wing has spent a lot of time living in Qatar, and they're the ones, because they were being supported by Qatar. Qatar is one of the main funders of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're allied with Turkey, and their kind of main regional adversaries are the UAE. So Qatar has been supporting a lot of the extremists in Syria. So they were pressuring the Hamas political leadership to support the rebels in Syria. But the point is, the Hamas armed wing did not support the rebels in Syria because the Hamas armed wing had been supported by Syria, the Syrian government. So there are these kind of complex internal dynamics happening. But the point is that Hamas is not an Iranian proxy. Hezbollah is not an Iranian proxy. They have gotten support from Iran, and they're proud of that. And they're thankful to Iran for that. But they're political allies who share similar interests in a larger alliance, the axis of resistance, but they're not proxies. And this is why the US can't understand why Palestinians keep fighting. They keep fighting because they are oppressed. Their land is being stolen. Their family members have been killed. How many orphans are there in Gaza who have lost all of their family members? Do people think that they're going to grow up and love Israel? No, they're going to grow up and fight Israel because Israel took everything from them. So unless Israel kills everyone or expels everyone, which is its plan, they're in the stage of ethnically cleansing the northern part of Gaza, kicking out all of the Palestinians, and then killing everyone who remains. They understand that's the only way they can actually win, which is why it's so horrific seeing what's going on.
Yeah, I guess the calculus is different from people who are fighting in Syria, who are relying on a paycheck. They are literally fighting for their own survival. It's not like if they put down their arms, they're just going to be okay, and they can, they know what comes next. I wanted to ask if there's anything we could learn from Syria, but it almost seems like no matter where you are and who you are, with that 7-country list, where we're almost finished, we're almost all the way through it here, is the only lesson that when you're earmarked for destruction by these powers, resistance is futile. Now, of course, we have Lebanon, which is still standing. They still have their resistance force, but I don't know if they were really under attack as much as Syria was. And had they been faced with all of the same pressures that Syria had been, would they too fall? Like, is there any optimism here, or is it like I said, once you're earmarked for destruction, the odds are really against you?
Well, I don't think the odds are against you. I mean, because we can't be completely fatalistic. Like, you can see the kind of directions that history is moving in, but if you don't try to resist them, then it becomes inevitable, right? But it wasn't inevitable that the U.S. lost in Vietnam. The Vietnamese, all the odds were against them, and they were able to defeat the U.S., right?
That's a good point.
Or in Korea, which ultimately it was the U.S. that lost the Korean War. It was frozen, but the conflict. So, it's not inevitable. Obviously, it is very difficult. But I also think that, again, these things go in ebb and flows. Just a few months ago, everyone was saying that it looked like, look how weak Israel looked a few months ago. Now it's certainly looking stronger. But internationally, the reputational damage to Israel is massive. Despite this blow in Syria to the resistance, at the end of the day, Israel is facing charges of genocide at the International Court of Justice. Dozens of countries from the global south have expressed support for this case. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, the longest ever serving Prime Minister of Israel, is facing an arrest warrant on charges of crimes against humanity that's completely unprecedented by the ICC, which has a long history of being very biased against the global south. But this is still a welcome development. It's an attempt to save the reputation of the ICC. Otherwise, it would be completely irrelevant. But that's an important movement. We also see that around the world, countries have broken relations with Israel. There's an entire generation of young people who will only see Israel as a genocidal fascist regime, which is what it is. It's run by fascist maniacs. The finance minister, Smotrich, literally said that we want to starve all 2 million Gazans to death, but we can't because of the international community. He said that. I mean, these are maniacs. They're completely genocidal. They're constantly quoting verses from the Bible where they say you must destroy all of the men and women and all of their cows. Like, I mean, it's insane. So around the world, Israel is associated with genocide and fascism and colonialism. So even though in the short term it has made these very significant victories against Syria, it's taken territory in Syria, even in Lebanon, despite decapitating the Lebanese leadership, it has not been able to actually go deep into Lebanon at all. Israel's bombing the hell out of Lebanon, but it's basically losing. So despite the damage to Hezbollah, it's been able to defend the sovereignty of Lebanon even better than it did in 2006. And in 2006, Hezbollah won that war. So it's easy to be very depressed because this is a victory in the short term in this battle, not in the overall war, but it's a victory for the U.S. and Israel. But again, I think in the medium to the long term, the situation in Israel is very dire. We haven't even talked about the economy in Israel, which is in collapse. They've had massive brain drain. Doctors, engineers, technicians, they've all been leaving the country. Anyone with a dual passport, well, there are a lot of Israelis who have passports in the US and Canada and Europe and Australia and New Zealand. They've been leaving. I mean, this is a country that is in a severe situation. And yeah, they can portray themselves as very powerful because they just attack all their neighbors all the time because the US floods them with billions of dollars of weapons. And the US ultimately, the most important weapon that the US empire has, is the dollar. So the US can fund Israel perpetually because the US can just print more money. But the days of US dollar hegemony are also numbered. So, history doesn't move neatly in one direction. It zigs and zags, but I think we can still see clearly that Israel is on a very self-destructive path, even if it's able to do a lot of damage. And this is the same thing for the US. The US empire is clearly in decline, but it's going to do a lot of damage in the years and decades to come. Our responsibility is we should try to minimize the amount of damage that the US does. And of course, the biggest potential danger is World War III. And we should do everything we can to prevent that kind of thing from happening. But, just because the US and Israel in the long term are clearly declining doesn't mean that they'll still have some short-term victories.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there has been a serious global awakening, and a lot of it came at the expense of Palestinian blood. And I think there's a lot of people that want to make sure that the cost, the price of this awakening was not in vain. I mean, the world has awoken. I mean, different people have had different moments of awakening or their geopolitical awakening. This is it for so many people. I guess, we covered a lot. I'll end on asking, if there's any other aspects of this conflict that are, perhaps underreported or anything else you'd like people to know about or to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention refugees. I feel bad for not mentioning that earlier, which is another part of the kind of collapse of the Syrian state, because you have one of the worst refugee crises in modern history. The cost of war project at Brown University, which is a very mainstream elite university in the US, they estimated that the wars fueled by the US after 9/11 killed more than 4 million people, nearly 5 million people, and displaced more than 30 million people. 30 million refugees because of these US wars in Iraq and Syria and Libya, Afghanistan. I mean, it's just complete chaos. Think about what the US has done to this region in the past 20, 30 years. My entire lifetime, I don't remember because I was a little baby, but the Gulf War, like literally my entire life, the US has been at war in this region, destabilizing this region. So, I mean, it's not just the destruction to the countries internally, it's also the refugees. So many Syrians are living abroad in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Europe. This has caused significant instability. It's also fueled the rise of the far right in Europe, right? Because you have these far right groups that scapegoat refugees. And instead of saying, why are we continuing to wage war and destabilize all these countries? We should stop destabilizing them. Instead, they say they scapegoat the refugees, right? So, like, this has caused so much turmoil around the world, not just in the region itself. And then in Syria and in Iraq, with these wars, you also have massive brain drain. It's not just the number of refugees, it's also you have entire generations of doctors and engineers and the people you need to run a modern society who've all left because they're like, why would I stay here? First of all, it's unsafe. Second of all, even if I stay here, I'm going to get paid nothing because of the inflation. Like, why would I be a doctor in Syria if I can go to Europe? Like, I mean, so we've destroyed, and like, I shouldn't say we, I always think of Michael Parenti. Michael Parenti always emphasized, stop saying we. The US government doesn't represent us. European governments don't represent the people. They represent the oligarchy. It's not we. Western governments, the US primarily, but also European governments, and also the Canadian government, they have destroyed these countries for generations. I mean, they destroyed Iraq for at least a generation or two. They destroyed Syria for at least a generation or two. It is such a tragedy. And there's so much potential. Think about, like, this region, historically, there was so much potential. These are highly educated people. This is where science and algebra and mathematics comes out of West Asia, right? Like the most famous scientist, while Europe was in the Middle Ages, this was the region of the world that was creating soap and algebra. And like, it's just so sad to see what has happened to this region. And then meanwhile, the West continues to prop up the most reactionary monarchies. That's what the US wants and the West wants for this region. It wants monarchies and Israel. I mean, it's so sad.
Yeah, it really is remarkable when you when you look at it, especially that point you made about the rise of this right-wing element that is scapegoating on migrants and refugees without making the connection, particularly in Europe, where they don't really have sovereignty from the US. They follow the US along with almost everything. And they don't make that connection and say, hey, well, why don't we, on the contrary, they're actually celebrating, saying, yeah, we should overthrow dictators, and then complaining about the results of that. I mean, the president of Mexico had a call with Trump, and she said very directly to him, she said, you want to solve your migrant crisis, stop sanctioning places like Cuba and Venezuela. I mean, how simple, how clear is that logic? I don't understand why people can't get it, but you're absolutely right. The people who will suffer are those migrants. So.
Yeah, in the case of Latin America, it's even clearer. I mean, so Trump just appointed Marco Rubio. He nominated Marco Rubio to be a Secretary of State. Marco Rubio is as much of a neocon as it gets. He's never seen a war he didn't love. And he has openly called for the U.S. military to invade Venezuela. So meanwhile, Trump is saying, he's scapegoating immigrants for everything and saying he wants to do mass deportations. You think they're going to have fewer immigrants if you invade and overthrow countries in Latin America? No, it's exactly what you said. You need to help stabilize these countries, which is good for them and good for you. Like, look, I think we should treat refugees and migrants with respect, but I think there are also some people on the left who sometimes ignore the fact that these refugee flows destroy the countries that people are fleeing from, right? Because you get brain drain, you get entire generations of people who leave these countries, and then we should want to help stabilize these countries. And I say this as someone who spends part of the year living in Nicaragua. Like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, they don't want millions of their people going to the US. They want them staying in their own countries and making their countries more prosperous and helping to develop and becoming doctors and engineers there and not going to the US. We should treat refugees and immigrants with respect, right, and equal rights. But the response is not just to say, oh, well, keep overthrowing and destabilizing their governments and then accept all the refugees. That's what the Democrats want, is keep destabilizing all of these countries and fueling their wars, but then you can accept the refugees. And the Republicans say, keep fueling the wars and destabilizing these countries, but kick out the refugees. I think we should say, well, we can have immigrants and refugees, but we also should stop destabilizing these countries and allow them to stay in their countries. That seems to me to be the most logical choice. But of course, it's not profitable for the military-industrial complex.
No, absolutely not. And I think that's a really good note to end on, especially to drive that point home to people who haven't made that connection yet. I suspect a lot of the kinds of people who follow us already have, but just in case, definitely that's a good point to drive home. Thank you so much for joining us and for explaining and bringing a little bit more clarity to the situation in Syria.
Thanks, Daniel. It was a great discussion.
Chat soon.